Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new edition of Euroquestions, the bi-monthly webinar by the Jacques Delors Institute. Today, we have the pleasure to welcome Christine Verger, Vice President of the Jacques Delors Institute. Citizens across all the European Union are being called into the polls on the 6th and the 9th June of next year, 2024, to renew their representative at the European Parliament. This vote will be decisive as the European Parliament is the co-legislator and has significant power. The result of the election will influence the subsequent choice of the leader of the EU main institution, the European Commission, the European Council, and the European Parliament. The forthcoming elections are taking place against an unprecedented context of the war in Ukraine, the relaunch of the enlargement process, an uprising Sino-American rivalry, climate change, and inflation. These challenges are numerous for European democracy at a time when criticisms to its model are becoming increasingly vocal as part of Europe. The coalition that emerged from this election will determine the effectiveness of Europe's action to unite the continent. Before handing the floor to our speaker, I would like to remind you that the Q&A tools is available at the bottom of your screen. Christine, you have the floor. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Lara, for having invited me. As you said, why those elections and European elections in general are so important. The first reason, of course, is that the European Parliament has important powers, in particular in the legislative fields, as it is a co-decider with the Council of Ministers in many areas. And the second reason, of course, is that the results will determine the choice of the leaders of the main European institutions and the type of political majority, or more precisely, the type of coalition emerging from the results, which will determine many choices for the future, even if the European Parliament is not the only source of power in the European Union, of course. I'll divide my short presentation in three parts: the actors, the possible themes, and the main challenges to face. The actors. There are three main actors: the national parties, the European parties, and the citizens. The national parties first. The voting system differs, as you all know, from one country to another, and European elections remain mainly national elections, as it's up to each party in each country to choose the candidates. And the selection process, as you may have noticed, has already started. By the way, it's always fascinating to note that the choice of candidates precedes the definition of a program. Secondly, the European parties. Not so many people know that there are European parties. We've just published in the Jacques Delors Institute a study on European political parties, their statute, their financing, their role, their influence. And to sum up, I would say that there are the European parties have three main functions. Since 2014, they select candidates for the presidency of the Commission, one or more, according to the political families. They adopt a European program common to all the parties belonging to the same political family, the Socialists, the Greens, etc. And all along the legislature, which is quite important, they establish a coordination between either the prime ministers of that political family before the European councils, or between the ministers of specific councils of ministers. Because let's not forget that the European Parliament is organized through political groups, through political families, and not according to national delegations. In the European Parliament, just to remind you, there are 7 political groups: the EPP, which is the center-right, the Socialists and Social Democrats, Renew, which is the Liberals, the Greens, ID, Identity and Democracy, which is, let's say, the extreme right, ECR, European Conservatives and Reformists, which is between the EPP and ID, and the left. Until 2009, the EP was dominated by the EPP and the Socialists, which had the majority, only the two of them. And since since 2019, they don't have the majority anymore. And compromises have to be built with larger majorities, including most often the Liberals and the Greens. What will be the rapport de force, as we say, in the future parliament? Nobody knows, but I'll say something on this at the end of my presentation. Thirdly, the citizens. Of course, the citizens. They are the one who vote. But the legitimacy of the result in the end depends very much on how many citizens vote. And let's note that the participation in 2019 was higher than before, more than 50%, although it had constantly decreased since 1971. And this gives me the opportunity to mention an event which took place between 21 and 22, the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was launched to enable citizens selected by lot, on a whole 800 citizens, to participate in a reflection on the future of Europe. They met during 1 year and they adopted very substantive conclusions. Unfortunately, the media showed no interest in this conference, probably because there was not enough blood in this conference, but no doubt that the citizens concerned will try to intervene in one way or another with maybe members of the civil society in the course of the next campaign. Second part, the possible themes of the campaign. Let's say, to be very simple, that there are bad and good themes. The bad themes are those which have nothing to do with a European competence or your European dimension. Because there is always the risk that politicians use the European elections to talk about something else or to attack their political enemies on the national political scene. I think this risk may be a little bit diminished in 2024, given the fact that so many issues nowadays have a European dimension. And that's why the next European election may be more European, but in any case, very different from the last one in 2019, unpredictable, more complicated, and maybe more conflictual. The good themes will be European ones, but there are so many ones. What will be the main concerns of the citizens in 2024? What will be the state of play of the war in Ukraine and its consequences? What will be the economic context, energy, inflation, etc.? What will be the state of play on climate change? You can already see debates on the speed and modalities of the reforms to put in place. How many migrants will have crossed the seas and in which conditions and with which consequences? Will Europeans accept to enlarge the European Union to new countries, the Balkans and Ukraine? I don't know if those themes are good themes, but for sure they are of a historic importance for the future of Europe and deserve a lot of debates. The parties will have to define their positions on those different issues. And as I said before, this is not yet the case for many political parties. Third part, the challenges. I will mention three. There are others for sure, but I will mention three. The participation, the future balance of power, and democracy. Participation. In 2009, compared to 2014, as I said before, the participation increased substantially in 3/4 of the member states. In most cases, there was a parallel between the increase of the participation and the general attitudes in favor of the European Union. And it's also important to note that in 2019, for the young people, the protection of the environment as perceived as having a strong European dimension played an important role in the participation of the young people. The European Parliament published yesterday its Eurobarometer for the spring 2023. And the good news is that 56% of the persons indicate they are interested by the next European election, and 67 say that they would vote if the election was to take place this week, which is a rate much higher than the rate of the effective participation in 2009. And also 71% recognize the impact of EU on their daily life. The less good news is that 62% consider the general situation is worse in their country, and 47% are pessimistic on a whole, which could be linked to the degradation of the quality of life. Let's hope that for 2024, the participation will continue to rise, which would be a good signal to confirm the legitimacy of the European Parliament, the expectations towards it, and the relevance of the representative democracy at a European level. Second possible challenge, the future political balance of power within the European Parliament. Of course, it's difficult to predict what it will be, but important national elections, especially in Spain and Poland, will take place this year with possible changes of majorities. At the European level, this may have important consequences, of course, in the European Council, but also in the European Parliament. The ECR group in the European Parliament, the European Conservatives and Reformists, could also be reinforced by the Italian members of Fratelli d'Italia, which is the party of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Meloni, by the Spanish members of Vox, which in Spain may govern with the center-right party, the PP, and by the Polish members of the PiS, which is the ruling party in Poland. If it was the case, the ECR group could become the third group in the European Parliament instead of Renew, the Liberal family. And if it was the case, the question would be what sort of alliances could take place or not with the EPP, which is the center-right party in the European Parliament, which could lose some members. And in the recent polls, the socialists remain stable. But of course, are there convergences between the ECR and the EPP? I see two possible convergences on two subjects, immigration and environment. If you look, for instance, at the recent campaign launched by the EPP on this last issue, environment, for a regulatory slowdown. And at the same time, there could be strong resistances within the EPP to such an alliance, and also strong convergences inside the left, with center maybe, again, on a very positive agenda on the environment. So the real question is then, which coalition will support the future commission and with which content? Last but least, democracy. An election is always a test for democracy. In that case, for representative democracy, which seems to be more attractive at European level than at national level. And in Europe, where in some cases the rule of law and the basic principles of democracy and its values are contested, this election will also be a test. And finally, a test for the democratic model of a continent vis-à-vis the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine, for your enlightening presentation. And I know you and the Jacques Delors Institute with the European Parliament Political Observatory will closely follow the European election campaign. So we received a few questions. Maybe the first one, 4 years ago, the Spitzencandidate system was undermined by the appointment of Ursula von der Leyen or Manfred Weber to the head of the European Commission. Should we expect the system to make a comeback, or will it be against the undermined of member states?
Thank you for this question. The main political families have, for the moment, announced that they will probably again present candidates to the presidency of the Commission. The European Council in general doesn't like this procedure very much because, as you know, it's up to the European Council to propose a name for the presidency of the Commission. But since the Lisbon Treaty, the Parliament elects, after the proposal of the European Council, the President of the Commission and the College of Commissioners. This procedure started in 2014. Mr. Juncker, who was the candidate of the EPP as a Spitzenkandidat, was elected President of the Commission with the support of other political families, because in the European Parliament, and I think it will be the same next year, there is not a majority against an opposition. There have to be coalitions and compromises. So Mr. Juncker, although he was the candidate of the EPP, was also supported by the Socialists, the Centre, and even many Greens. In 2019, there were several Spitzenkandidaten again, but the European Council, although the EPP was the first political family in the results, didn't accept the name of the candidate of the EPP, Mr. Weber, and proposed another name, Mrs. van der Leyen. So the European Parliament was not so happy with this. In the end, as Mrs. van der Leyen was coming from the EPP, the European Parliament accepted her name, but she was elected in July 2019 with a very short majority. I think it was only 9 votes.
Yes.
Which was a sign of revolt of principle from the European Parliament towards the European Council. And in the end, Mrs. van der Leyen, after a long negotiation with the different political groups in the European Parliament, made it sure that the whole College of Commissioners was broadly accepted by the European Parliament. So what will happen this time? Again, as I said before, the parties will present candidates. It will be interesting to see what will be the names, because of course it depends very much also on the names. There are rumors, as you know very well, that Mrs. van der Leyen could be candidate again. If so, she will probably have to be the candidate of the EPP. And we'll see what will be other candidates and whether she gets a large support, including from other political families, to get re-elected. But as you know also, apart from this procedure for the Commission, there are other posts which have to be fulfilled after the European election, the presidency of the Council, the presidency of the Parliament in particular, and there may be, as always, a sort of package to satisfy the main political families in the final result.
Thank you. At a time of a great geopolitical instability, this election represents a particularly delicate moment for the EU. In this context, do you think that the issue of foreign interference and disinformation is a real problem? And if so, is the European Parliament carrying out any reflection on this issue, maybe enlightening with the Qatargate?
What is interesting on the Qatargate is that in the Eurobarometer, which was published by the European Parliament yesterday, it's clearly indicated that the Qatargate has absolutely no influence. At least this is the present situation on the opinions of the people who answered the questions. And for the moment, nothing new has happened since some money was discovered in the apartments of 2 members of Parliament. So we'll see whether there will be any evolution in that context. On interference and so on, you know, there is a special committee in the European Parliament which was installed in the recent months, and they are particularly studying these aspects, which could be of a certain importance during the electoral campaign, like in any electoral campaign in our national countries and in the world in general. We could see, particularly in the United States, for instance, in recent years, strong problems from that point of view. So it's even possible that the Commission may propose some new legislation in that respect in order to control as much as possible foreign interferences in the European electoral campaign.
Thanks. Maybe another question, no worries. How can the European Parliament organize itself after the election if no large bloc has a majority? If the groups are balanced between themselves, Green, SND, Renew, EPP, and the far right?
Well, as I said before, in the European Parliament, it was never one bloc against another bloc. It's always a compromise between several political families. And there are two sorts of compromises. There could be a general political compromise to be established after the European election to support the future Commission with large trends of agreements. And the future program of the Commission will depend very much on this possible coalition, which nobody knows what it will be. Until now, it was, as I said, EPP, Socialists plus Liberals and Greens, to say things very simply, a broad pro-European majority. But you can have also different majorities according to the themes. In certain cases, you can have the Socialists plus the Liberals and the Greens, which form a majority above 50%. On other themes, it could be a more right-wing majority, depending on the subjects. So that's why sometimes the European Parliament is difficult to explain in our national context, where there is always a fight between an opposition and a majority. In the European Parliament, there are a lot of discussions. People meet all the time. They try to find compromises in the European interest. In general, it works. So I'm sure next year, even if there are some shifts here and there, we'll find again a broad majority to support a program for the future Commission.
Thank you. In your presentation, you mentioned your publication on the European political party. There is a question, can the Europarty use this election to gain influence, according to you?
It depends very much on the national parties, because those European parties have no right to campaign in the national campaigns. So, as I said at the beginning of my intervention, they play a role in defining a common program, which could be an inspiration for the national parties. They select candidates for the presidency of the Commission, and they play an important role in the daily life of the Council of Ministers. But in the European campaign itself, they can't play a formal role. The national parties can invoke the European family if they decide to do so. But it depends very much on each national party. For instance, if you take a party like the Greens, it's very often the case that in the national campaign for the European elections, the Greens refer to their European family, because there are, with exceptions, of course, there is a big common ground between all of them. May not be the case in other political families where national parties don't like so much to refer to their European political family because of some divergences here or there. And in most national parties until now, the logo of the European Party was not necessarily present. So to conclude, the only way for the European parties to be influenced in the national electoral campaigns is through the proposal of a candidate for the presidency of the Commission. And we'll see next year who will be the candidates.
Thank you. Maybe another question that you already mentioned that, Tip, but how will the extreme far-right groups organize themselves with the upcoming election in Spain and the shift in Sweden and Italy, for example? Do you think that the groups at the far right of the parliament will change? We're talking about Meloni joining the EPP, for example.
As I said before, the ECR, which is not the far right, let's say, it's a question of definition, may be reinforced after this European election, because let's talk about the big countries in terms of numbers of members of parliament which they will send. If you see the ECR, they are before they had the British Conservatives. Of course, the British Conservatives have left. So now they have the Polish members, which are very important. And we'll see after the Polish elections what will be the weight of this party, whether they will still win the elections or whether the opposition party, the Civic Platform, which is in the EPP, will win or not the election. This may have consequences. And if you take that specific Polish question, I don't see an alliance between the PiS, which is in the ECR, and the Civic Platform, which is the EPP. Then the Italians, of course, following Mrs. Meloni's accession to the power in Italy, it's rather predictable that there will be more Italian members from her party in the European Parliament, which may reinforce the ECR for sure. You have another in Italy ally of Mrs. Meloni, which is La Lega of Mr. Salvini, who is at the moment in the far-right group idea with Madame Le Pen from France. And it's possible, this is a rumor at least, that members of the Lega may want to join the ECR group. We'll see. The third ally of Mrs. Meloni in the Italian government being Forza Italia from Mr. Berlusconi, which is in the EPP. So the three parties which are in the government of Mrs. Meloni are in three different groups in the European Parliament. We'll see whether there will be attempts to join those three forces, let's say, to be all of them in the same group in the European Parliament.
Thank you. And maybe a last question. So at last election in 2019, the British actually participate because Brexit was not over yet. Do you think that, well, next year, obviously not, but do you think that the next one will have a new member state with the enlargement process coming?
In 2024?
No, the 2019, if 29, if
no,
I'm
no, well, you are mentioning the enlargement process. Whatever happens for the enlargement process in the future for the Balkans, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, I think we can say for sure that it will not happen before 2029.
And do you think that at election in 2029, we will finally have the transnational list that we've been talking about for so long?
Yeah, well, it's an idea which the Jacques Delors Institute has always defended.
And we still are.
Exactly. Now, President, Mr. Letta, many countries, including Germany, for instance, it is in their coalition agreement, defend, but there are still resistances. In many countries, in particular in Scandinavia and also in the Eastern countries, but sometimes also in other countries, especially, let's say, the small and medium-sized countries who fear that those transnational lists may favor the big countries. So there are many efforts to try and prove to them that this would not be the case. I would add also that it would be a question of 10 or 15 or 20 members of the European Parliament, not more, who would be elected in a pan-European constituency. So maybe, I think, in 2019, progress will have been made, but there are behind the oppositions a lot of ideology also, and it's very much linked to the global conception you have of the European Union and the relation between the national level and the European level. So let's hope.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll closely follow that. So thank you again, Christine, for your presentation. And thank you to you for following today's Euroquestion. We will soon send you the replay to you. The next session will be held on Wednesday, 28th of June with Elvire Fabry, Senior Researcher at the Jacques Delors Institute. She will come back to us on the EU economical security. Thank you again, Christine, and see you in 3 weeks.